Murdaugh murders. Power, money, and a family on trial. On the night of June 7th, 2021, a 911 call was placed from a rural property in South Carolina. The caller sounded shaken. He told dispatchers that he had just discovered his wife and son shot near the dog kennels on their estate. The property was known locally as Murdaugh, large, private, set back from the road. The man on the phone was Alec Murdaugh. For generations, the Murdaugh family name had carried weight in the region. 3 generations had served as powerful prosecutors in the Lowcountry. The family law firm handled major civil cases. Judges knew them. Police knew them. Politicians knew them. When Alec Murdaugh reported the deaths of his wife Maggie and his son Paul, the initial reaction was not suspicion. It was shock. Maggie Murdaugh had been shot multiple times. Paul Murdaugh, just 22 years old, had also been killed at close range. There were no signs of forced entry onto the property, no clear suspect waiting in the open. The setting was quiet, dark, rural. In the early hours of the investigation, Alec told responding officers that he had not been present at the time of the shootings. He said he had visited his mother that evening. He claimed he returned to find the bodies. Body camera footage captured the immediate aftermath. His voice trembled. He appeared distraught. At that moment, law enforcement treated him as a grieving husband and father. But context matters. And the context surrounding the Murdaugh family was already complicated. 2 years earlier, Paul Murdaugh had been involved in a fatal boating crash that killed a 19-year-old woman. The case had drawn public attention. Allegations surfaced that the Murdaugh name had influenced early handling of that crash. Civil lawsuits were pending. Financial pressure was mounting. Behind the scenes, investigators began uncovering something else. Irregularities in Alec Murdaugh's finances, money missing from clients, loans that had not been disclosed, payments redirected. The timeline around June 7th began to tighten. Cell phone records were analyzed, vehicle data was downloaded, surveillance footage was reviewed. At first, Alec stated clearly that he had not been near the dog kennels before discovering the bodies. He repeated it, firmly. But technology introduced a problem. A short video recovered from Murdaugh's phone placed Alec at the kennels minutes before the shootings. His voice could be heard in the background. That recording contradicted his earlier statements. When confronted with the evidence months later, Alec admitted he had lied. He said he had been paranoid, that he feared law enforcement would assume guilt because of the family's history. But the lie shifted the center of the case. Investigators now had motive possibilities. The boating lawsuit threatened financial exposure. Court hearings were approaching. On the same day Maggie and Paul were killed, Alec was allegedly confronted by his law firm about missing funds. The convergence of personal crisis, financial scrutiny, and pending civil litigation formed a pattern investigators could not ignore. The property itself offered limited clues. Shell casings were collected, weapons were not immediately recovered, but digital data continued to narrow the timeline. Phone activity from Maggie and Paul ceased abruptly. Alex's movements before and after the time of death were examined closely. Within months, the narrative around the case transformed. What began as an apparent ambush by unknown assailants became an investigation centered on the man who made the 911 call. In September 2021, another event complicated matters further. Alec Murdaugh reported that he had been shot on the side of a rural road. He survived. Initially, it appeared he had been targeted. But that story also unraveled. Authorities later alleged that the roadside shooting had been staged, that Alex had arranged it in an attempt to secure insurance money for his surviving son. The layers deepened. Financial crimes were formally charged. Millions of dollars were traced to fraudulent activity. Clients who trusted the Murdaugh name had been defrauded. The image of a powerful Southern legal dynasty began collapsing publicly. And at the center of that collapse stood one question. Did Alec Murdaugh kill his wife and son? By July 2022, a grand jury indicted him on 2 counts of murder. The case would move to trial. And what unfolded in that courtroom would become one of the most watched legal proceedings in recent American history. Because this was not only a murder trial, it was a dismantling of power, of reputation, of a name that had dominated a region for nearly a century. When the trial of Alec Murdaugh began in January 2023, the courtroom in Colleton County, South Carolina, filled quickly. National media arrived. Legal analysts lined the back rows. Residents who had known the Murdaugh name for decades waited quietly to see how it would hold up under scrutiny. The prosecution's theory was direct. Alec Murdaugh was facing exposure. His financial crimes were beginning to surface. Civil litigation from the 2019 boating crash threatened to reveal years of misappropriated funds. On the same day Maggie and Paul were killed, he had been confronted by his law firm about missing money. According to prosecutors, the murders were a desperate act, an attempt to create sympathy, to delay scrutiny, to redirect attention. The defense presented a different picture. They argued that the state had no direct evidence, no eyewitness, no recovered murder weapons, no blood spatter proving he pulled the trigger. They suggested that the investigation had narrowed too quickly, that law enforcement, aware of the family's reputation, had rushed to judgment. The state relied heavily on digital evidence, phone data, vehicle telemetry, step counts, text messages. The timeline was constructed minute by minute. Prosecutors walked the jury through the evening of June 7th. They showed that Maggie and Paul had been using their phones shortly before 8:50 p.m. Then, abruptly, both devices went silent. No further messages, no movement. Paul's phone, however, contained something critical. A short video recorded minutes before his death. In that video, taken at the dog kennels, multiple voices could be heard. Paul, Maggie, and unmistakably, Alex. Investigators testified that this recording placed Alex at the scene approximately 5 minutes before phone activity ceased. Earlier statements to police had insisted he was not there. That lie became central. During the trial, jurors watched body camera footage from responding officers. They heard Alex's voice that night. They compared it to the kennel video. The timeline tightened. Vehicle data from his SUV showed activity shortly after the estimated time of death. The car's system recorded when doors opened, when the engine started, when speeds changed. Prosecutors argued that his movements were inconsistent with shock, inconsistent with a man who had just stumbled upon tragedy. The defense countered that grief does not follow a predictable pattern. They emphasized the lack of direct forensic proof linking him to the trigger. They highlighted in investigative analysis so that experts testified it was for an impact. The weapons used in the murders were recovered. The state said they may have been disposed of, but suggestion is not evidence. As the weeks passed, the trial expanded beyond murder. The jury heard testimony about financial deception. Former clients described settlement funds that never reached them. Colleagues testified about irregular transactions. The argument was reinforced repeatedly. Pressure, exposure, desperation. Then, in a rare move, Alex Murdaugh took the stand in his own defense. For nearly 2 days, he answered questions. He admitted to stealing millions from clients. He admitted to lying to law enforcement about being at the kennels. He attributed the lies to paranoia fueled by opioid addiction. He denied killing his wife and son. His voice broke at times. He referred to Paul by a nickname. He wept openly. The prosecution cross-examined him methodically. They replayed earlier statements. They compared them to the kennel video. They questioned the logic of his timeline. They pressed him on why he would lie about such a critical detail if he were innocent. His response remained consistent. He said he panicked. He said he feared being falsely accused. The courtroom atmosphere shifted during his testimony. Some observers believed his emotion was genuine. Others saw calculation. The jury, composed of ordinary residents, watched closely. When closing arguments began, the state returned to simplicity. There were no eyewitnesses, but there was timing. There were lies. There was financial collapse. They argued that circumstantial evidence, when aligned precisely, can form a clear picture. The defense reminded jurors of the burden of proof, beyond reasonable doubt. Not suspicion, not possibility, certainty. Deliberations began. They did not last long. After less than 3 hours, the jury returned. Guilty on both counts of murder. The verdict echoed beyond the courtroom. The Murdaugh name, once synonymous with legal authority in the region, was now tied to conviction. In sentencing, the judge spoke directly. He referenced the decades of influence held by the family. He referenced the magnitude of betrayal. Alex Murdaugh was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The legal dynasty that had dominated the Low Country for nearly a century ended not with retirement, but with incarceration. Yet even after the verdict, questions remained in public discussion. Not legal questions, human ones. How does someone with wealth, influence, and status reach that point? Was it greed, fear, addiction, or the slow erosion of accountability over generations? The courtroom provided a decision, but understanding does not always follow conviction. After the verdict, the courtroom emptied slowly. There was no dramatic outburst, no final confrontation, just the quiet recognition that something generational had ended. For nearly a century, the Murdaugh family had occupied a position of authority in South Carolina's Low Country. 3 generations had served as elected solicitors. Their law firm handled major civil litigation. Their name appeared on buildings, letterhead, and court filings. Now, it appeared in sentencing documents. In the weeks following the conviction of Alex Murdaugh, attention turned to the broader web of financial crimes. The murder trial had focused on motive and timeline, but parallel investigations had already uncovered a pattern of fraud spanning years. Clients who believed settlements were secured on their behalf later learned that funds had been diverted, checks rerouted, accounts manipulated, millions of dollars traced through shell transactions. Former colleagues testified about trust, about reputation, about how difficult it had been to imagine deception coming from someone so established. The collapse did not happen overnight. It unfolded in layers. First, the boating crash in 2019 involving Paul Murdaugh had drawn public scrutiny. Civil litigation followed. Financial discovery threatened to expose irregularities. Then, on the very day Maggie and Paul were killed, Alec had reportedly been confronted by his law partners about missing money. That convergence of pressure became central to the prosecution's motive theory. After conviction, additional financial charges continued moving through court. Each filing added detail. Each hearing reinforced the same pattern: abuse of position, manipulation of trust, misuse of authority. The once powerful law firm rebranded. The family name was removed from signage. Public trust in the local legal system was shaken. For residents of the Low Country, the impact extended beyond one man's actions. The Murdaugh name had long been associated with influence. That influence had shaped prosecutions, plea deals, and civil settlements. Now, communities questioned how much weight reputation had carried in past cases. How many assumptions had gone unchallenged? The ripple effect was institutional.
Meanwhile, Alex Murdaugh's surviving son, Buster, remained outside the courtroom's direct outcome.
His name surfaced in speculation online, but no charges were filed against him. The separation between legal evidence and public rumor became increasingly important. In high-profile cases, the line between fact and narrative often blurs, but courtrooms require proof. And proof, in this case, centered squarely on one individual. Psychologists and legal commentators later analyzed the behavioral patterns revealed during trial. The repeated lies, the financial manipulation, the compartmentalization of identities, public father and husband, private debtor, community leader, secret fraudster. Such contradictions rarely exist in isolation. They develop over time, reinforced by success, shielded by reputation. The Murdaugh trial also demonstrated the role of digital evidence in modern prosecution. It was not a confession that secured conviction. It was data. A short kennel video, step counts recorded by phones, vehicle telemetry timestamps, small digital traces that aligned too precisely to ignore. In earlier decades, such evidence would not have existed. The outcome might have been different. The jury's swift deliberation suggested that circumstantial evidence, when consistent and layered, can carry decisive weight. Yet even after sentencing, discussion continued. Some questioned whether the financial crimes unfairly influenced the murder verdict. Others argued that character evidence, while limited in scope, provided necessary context for motive. Appeals were filed. Legal arguments raised about jury instructions and admissibility of evidence. The appellate process, methodical and slower, began, but the conviction stood. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, its weight does not rest solely on the act of violence. It rests on erosion, on how small deceptions, repeated over years, can build a structure that eventually collapses under its own strain. The murders ended 2 lives. The trial ended a dynasty. But the underlying lesson is quieter. Power without scrutiny becomes insulation. Insulation without accountability becomes risk. And risk, when layered desperation, can produce irreversible decisions. The Murdaugh case lingers not because it is mysterious. The verdict was clear. It lingers because it shows how reputation can delay suspicion, how influence can distort perception, and how, eventually, even the most established names answer to evidence. After sentencing, the courtroom returned to its usual rhythm. Other cases were called, other names were read, the system moved forward. But the Murdaugh case did not leave public consciousness as quickly. It lingered because of scale. 2 murders, millions in stolen funds, generations of influence undone in a matter of months. In many ways, the story felt larger than the crime scene. The rural property known as Moselle became symbolic. It was no longer simply land. It represented privacy, privilege, and isolation, a place where power once seemed secure. The trial transcripts were studied in law schools. Analysts discussed the role of circumstantial evidence. The kennel video became a modern example of how a few seconds of digital recording can redefine an entire case. Without that recording, the timeline might have remained ambiguous. With it, contradictions became measurable. The Murdaugh name, once spoken with familiarity and deference in the Low Country, became associated with caution. Local legal processes underwent scrutiny. Community conversations changed tone. People who once assumed stability began questioning influence. The appeal process continues quietly in the background, as appeals often do. But regardless of future procedural outcomes, the public perception has shifted permanently. The dynasty ended not through retirement or generational transition, but through conviction. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, it carries a particular weight. Not because the facts are unclear, they are documented extensively. Not because the verdict is disputed in court, it stands. It lingers because of contrast. The contrast between public respect and private deception, between authority and vulnerability, between reputation and reality. If you step back from the headlines, one question remains quietly present. At what point does someone begin believing their own insulation? At what point does influence feel permanent enough to justify risk? And when that belief fractures, how quickly does everything unravel? The Murdaugh case does not end with a mystery. It ends with accountability. But accountability does not erase complexity. It does not simplify motive into a single word. Fear, greed, addiction, desperation. Each played a role in the narrative presented in court. The jury weighed them and delivered its answer. If you had been seated in that courtroom, hearing weeks of testimony, watching the digital timelines align minute by minute, would you have reached the same conclusion? Or would the absence of a recovered weapon have created doubt? These are the questions that keep cases like this alive long after sentencing. Not because they lack resolution, but because they force us to consider how evidence outweighs assumption, how reputation can delay scrutiny, and how, eventually, even the most established names are reduced to facts in a courtroom. As the night continues, this story settles where it belongs. Not dramatic, not sensational, simply recorded. Thank you for listening.